the corruption and destabilizing mechanisms derived by the insurgent terrorists who plotted and carried out 9/11, who, not being Muslims, as the function of their alcoholic and drug-induced sex parties would thoroughly indicate, would be derivative of the fact of them being recruited by the Confederacy, which is a long-standing insurgency against the United States, seeking the compromise of it by conversions in collaboration with other traders in the West who have been compromised by the USSR and having engaged in long-standing functions of systems of corruptions and profits derivative of those corruptions were proven mechanisms on how to become a parasite and destroy the system from the inside, allowing for the Soviet leader at the time, I believe it was Khrushchev, who said that they would destroy the West without firing a single bullet, at which point this conversion increased in the function of the creation of China as a superpower, as a communist function, which then, having been promoted by taking the money and resources from the West, as practiced with the creation of the Soviet Union, uh, or rather the Nazi Party, by the collapsing of the stock market as an investment into the creation of the Nazi Party as a military force, according to its secret agreements, did the same thing in the creation of the Communist Party in the Chinese government, or the CCP. To this end, the mechanism of their systemic disloyalty in their mostly fascist little communist operations engaged in their criminal entanglements with the mafia and other arrangements to systemically find forces and recruits against the nation as they engage in these terrorist operations and break down systematic laws, engaging in the function of their insurgency, having use of the KKK's insurgency inside of the government, engaged in the dealings with the double agents as they systematically infuse the collapsed structure by the virus, which reproduces the RNA of the virus instead of the host cell, and thus instead of the constitutional republic being served, the insurgent terrorists, having no loyalty to the nation, reproduce the virus instead. To this ends the mechanism of stealing the equipment for unofficial acts against the general public for the purposes of the collapse of the system, materialize the targeting of the elites projected by the military intelligence algorithms projecting David Bowles and many of the others, at which point systematically obstructing contracts against the law by the use of those equipments materialize the function of the devil agency engaging in takings in the compulsion of the human trafficking set up by Lindsey Graham's Confederacy, which is compelled labor or work hours engaging in the automated wages plus bonuses, which are essential, which with David Bowles they projected since infancy, as understood before he was born, as 25.6 million an hour plus benefits at a competitive rate for the benefits in the auction house of those seeking his time, at which point the obstructed value, including the terrorist operations and oppositions to the competitors in order to artificially keep the prices low, include the sexual market value as they engage in systemic humiliation rituals in order to engage in the acceleration opportunities by the parents' right activists in order to engage in their preferred sexual options for their children and society abroad as they engage the infused mafia operations and sex trafficking of the general public, as it is not your body, it is the Communist Party's body, and therefore choosing to have sex with someone not approved by the Soviets of the parents' rights activists is theft from the Communist Party, which will be retaliated against maliciously. To these ends, the mechanisms of those traumatizations and thefts engaged in the various security mechanisms which they had already believed, as the life insurance systematically collapsed into its base form until they could completely eradicate it in the violation of the constitutional right of not being punished without due process. And therefore, these techniques of assaults and batteries and subversions by the enforcement of their communism in a subversion of the free association and the right to contract and the right to pursue your own happiness materializes the obstructed contract schedule for the restructuring of the society in favor of the hate group, which is altering the records and the rewriting of history as they defraud the record by the use of their subversions, such as the mechanism of pre-crime or punishment without due process, which, being a strict violation of the United States, is promoted by William Barr and other hated enemies of the nation, which, viewing the Constitution in contempt, is not a part of the lawful government and therefore is a part of the Confederate insurrection, such as Scalia's position that the executive is isolated in its authority to not be subject to checks and balances, and therefore, if a judge is ordered to manufacture the Holocaust in the United States for the final solution, there is nothing that can be done, as the thing was so ordered and therefore must be executed, and there is no oversight function and therefore cannot be subverted. Therefore, the function of the Soviet Union's plan manufactures itself to its completion upon the realization of their daydream for the Satanist rule and nightmare scenario of the hellscape that is their control over anything. Now, the falsification of these records has the obstructed record in mind when it engages in their systemic abuses, including the use of David's Bank, which would have provided credit cards, which would have been fully backed, at which point their use of this system in order to engage in armed robberies amounts to the function of the purchase through the credit card, at which point the projected 27% fees and other liabilities would be attached to the function of their use of it through the system, at which point the seizing of those resources in order to engage in their communist depletion from their struggling sessions and starvation campaigns materializes the degrowth of the general public by these armed robberies through the mafia tactics for the Soviet Union, at which point these materially liable parties engaged in the function of those purchases for the systematic collapse and humiliation of the victims as the general public learns to hate the victim and love the abuser, and celebration of the chaos and subversion of all forms of order, forego and ignore every legal procedure essential to the use of the lawful activities of those functions or official acts, which are thoroughly ignored in favor of their persistent application of unofficial acts for the traumatized abuse against the public for the white supremacist communism, which is the justification behind old money leaning left, which reinforces these pretenses. Now, the United States, engaging in the function of the takings according to the takings clause, has to pay for everything that they take, including the use of the services, which includes the use of the bonded credit from the credit cards, which they use in that mechanism, which is the purchase through that service. Now, the position that they want to do is to owe too much to be able to pay, which is fundamentally unfair and disqualified as a legal opinion, but it is an objective in their judicial activism in opposition and hatred and contempt for the United States and its court systems, as the Constitution is systematically thrown out as their enemy, as they are an enemy of the Constitutional Republic in a war that they have leveraged. In this espionage war that they have leveraged is engaged in this celebration in systematic conversion of education structures for their Soviet Union, engaging in the superiority of the white supremacy and therefore the purging of everyone who is not the right type of white, which includes anyone who would protect the other groups, which would systematically require them to become guilty of the very precedents that they would be abused of historically, modernly, and in the future. And to this end, their systematic entrapment schemes gets their permission to those abuses, which then nullifies their claims in law as they socialize the injuries from the scam artists from the Confederates' overthrow of the United States, and they capitalize or use capitalism as a mechanism of not protecting the victims thereof, and therefore the systematic use of extortion as they use these coercive means and tactics through their insurgency in the Fed and others, as is projected throughout history, materializes the function of the plots to traumatize the general public and break the back of the American economy, their hated enemy, such as is proven in the War on David and other techniques in its surrounding mechanisms as they systematically targeted the projected elites, therefore crafting society. And therefore the function of the celebration of capitalism is not those who can acquire in a free market fair scenario, but rather those who are capable of acquiring capital. And therefore the use of white supremacy communism centralizes the opportunities and pushes out the right to contract for those who are not the right type of white, according to the central plan, materializing the function of communism as an express definition. And the fundamental to these operations includes the systematic dismantlement of the system, including the protection of their war crimes against the American government, such as the constitutional rights being dismantled, especially the right to self-defense or a right to a lawyer or others, which are systematically barred in the blocking of the pursuit of the remedy according to their hate groups' operations as their roaming marauders of Klan terrorists engaged in hate crime damages as is derived by what is desirable according to their Klan rallies materializes the super hyping of each other until they've collapsed into the lowest common denominator of intelligence as they engage in a raging frothing madness and systematically enforce their terrorists on the basis of that very same madness as a pseudo-drug-induced psychopathy derived by those who have subjugated themselves to the brain rot of narcotics of the various forms, directly and indirectly, materializing the specific biases specifically sought by those parties as a joke until it becomes leverage and therefore useful and therefore preferred according to the terror factory in order to not enforce against the terrorist plot which they see through to its material ends, acquiring their political, social, economic, and other hate crime outcomes desired by their terrorist operations by the Confederacy against these United States, as they are and have always been a malignant or malicious hate group in active rebellion. And therefore, those systematic damages include the function of their acknowledgement of the taking of services. Now, if you are to go to the store and buy a Snickers bar, it'll cost you your $2.50 or whatever it is. But if you go in and you take too many Snicker bars for you to be able to afford, then this is their strategic plot, which systematically is fraudulent. Therefore, the mechanism of being guilty of too much to be able to be punished is the confession to their existence as an enemy combatant to the government or society at large, and as a public enemy must be dealt with the same vigor and veracity as is derived in the war on terror, as those who aid and give comfort and support and funding and supplies to terrorists, according to George W. Bush, are to be labeled enemy combatants to the United States government, And this must be seen through, despite the function of their insurgency, which, as an insurgency's definition, is derived by their capability of infiltrating their enemy, the thing that they are doing, and therefore cannot be used as a mechanism to protect them, and therefore their various arguments are fraudulent and disqualified fundamentally as a sophistry confidence game, which must be destroyed with absolute veracity if we have any intention on surviving as a nation. Now, this includes the function of the purchase of the Revenge X channel's work hours, which then materializes its subcontract with the various nonprofits, which is disconnected to the authority of the purchase, as the purchase was derivative by the credit card in order for them to have not paid it, and therefore their plan was just to not settle the credit card balance, which is an illegitimate function. And without those uh, activities, the mechanism would have been the original schedule, which was changed by the human trafficking by Lindsey Graham's Confederacy. To this end, the mechanism of the compelled labor or slavery without due process is systematic violations of law, and therefore materializes the obligation to the complete functional correction and the restoration of the faculties and the removing of the obstruction by the coercion of the pursuit of the remedy by the blocking of the faculties projected in the contract schedule and all other benefits of the titles of the person's identity, uh, whoever they might have done this to. In the full diversity of targets that they would have done it to, the correction is mandatory as fundamental to national security. To this end, the material debts owed from those operations facilitate the obligation of their settlements, which includes the function of their confessions into the artistic, which then materialize their obligation to the laborer under the equivalent systems until the products have been finished and they can pay off the remainder of their liabilities. To this end, the material mechanism has explained itself that the federal debts have been entangled into the credit card structures debts according to earlier projections on a different system I don't have directly in front of me. To this end, the material definition of it as a federal debt materializes the inability of their escape from it, as it is a direct debt to the federal government. Similar to the student loan debts with the federal government, as the mechanism of the agreed subversion, as it's owed to the various parties according to those standard contracts, would have been applicable, as is understood by those parties who were targeting it to make the criminal obstruction of that system in the enforcement of their communism as an act of rebellion against the constitutional republic, which anyone in the United States military with any self-respect would fundamentally be obligated to engage in the destruction of all threats, foreign and domestic, which would include the reinforcement of the security being dismantled by their active sedition, which is functional rebellion. And the point of the sedition is the overthrow of the government, which is an act of treason, and therefore the high treason and high crimes actively incorporated into the singular entity of the crime of rebellion against the United States and its various subportions according to the legal categories derived by the legal examination from the lawyers and others would require its own in-depth examination, which I do not have directly in front of me. This, of course, requires the United States military, amongst others, to facilitate those legal campaigns in the pursuit of the remedy with David and Congress, as David is owed the right to have sued Congress for the right to pursue, as well as the right to pursue itself, and therefore the material function of his ability to have contracted in the obstructed titles acknowledges him, according to their own records, as him as the six-star intelligence oversight, congressional oversight general, to the end that becomes reality, it manufactures the point of their malice and aggression as the intelligence oversight investigator in chief materializes all of the essential pieces of information for Congress to make a sober, educated answer in the vote of a declaration of war against the threats to the United States, which is their obligation, which they have no authority to refuse, which they are blocking as an act of insurrection, disqualifying them from the office of Congress or any other aspects of the government, including receiving benefits from Social Security, as their act of rebellion may not give them access to many benefits directly associated, as is known by law according to records I do not have directly in front of me. Now, this also includes the function of various arbitrary missions, such as the Lahaina mission, where David was uh, introduced to the mission, which they renounced once they discovered that it was going to succeed, as they had fully set it up for him to fail. At which point, the function of them discovering that they were going to have to return his sexual options, or at least the sexual market value, disqualifying that and other essential functions to the Antichrist religious rituals according to their satanic operations in order to commit treason against the United States for revelations in the Bible, one world government led by the Antichrist, which includes the function of all of the debts owed to David Bowles, which would then be returned after the ritual's completion in order to assert the authority of the one world government under Satan, which requires all of those material powers that they have calculated owed to him, that they had restrained so that they could release it all at once, and therefore no one would know who the Antichrist is until all of a sudden he is revealed, at which point the sudden revelation of who he is derived by him being secretly known systematically until released as a collective system, as an understood legal compulsion, systematically no longer refusing to exist, which could only exist if you allow the pretext of all of those other systems, as the man of sin is derived by the lawlessness which would have crafted him by allowing the tolerance of the anarchy, systematically abusing it, which then facilitates the solutions against the anarchy by its own series of anarchy, which would be the mechanism that they would use in order to have built the confidence according to their ritual ceremonies in order to certify their God King, which are understandable and estimatable, which can be subverted systematically by any mechanism of studying of the proper subject, which would lead to systematic disqualifications of certain things which they violently protect, including the enforcement of the rape cult, which requires the active control of the sexual market, according to Plato's conspiracy, under the fake lottery derived by the parents' rights activist revolutionaries, and therefore it is broken down to the system of those who are actively engaged in the subversion, such as the position of Garland from Final Fantasy and his opposition by the Warriors of Light, who travel through time in order to correct against this, who then, according to the actual functional system, are tricked into it by the crafting of the illusion of Afrazu Bulul, who would then materially engage in the subversion, understanding that if you kill the man, you create the devil, at which point the function of having defeated him in order to oppose the devil, they did everything essential according to the ritual to create the devil, at which point that mechanism of reinforced systems create the delusion from the time-traveling Warriors of Light, which then materializes the obligation to have celebrated them for their hate crimes against society in the collapse of the general structure and security of that system, at which point the mechanism creates itself by the use of the scrying machine, which then leverages all of the systematic biases in order to craft the future they are trying to quote unquote avoid. making sure that they suffer the exact consequences that they are seeking in opposition to, as they commit all of the crimes which justify those things as a punishment, according to the precedents agreed to in the recrafting of law according to the anarchy and contracts, which, being viewed arbitrarily as superior to the Constitution, would then systematically avoid it according to the libertarian anarchy insurgencies, which, having been already compromised and corrupted according to those mechanisms by the Soviet Union's insurrectionists, materializes the function of the full threat against the United States upon maturity. So, having abandoned the Lahaina mission because it would be successful, similar to the function of the crash of '08 being abandoned because it would be successful and would only promote David and the other American elites against the insurrectionists, materializes the acknowledgement of this trade system, which would have required them to have engaged in the function of exchanging with David as acknowledged as Boss Baby from the very beginning, before they arrested him for being the patriarchy, which then materializes the obligation of the contract schedule, which is a known quantity which would have been sold as a collective unit, automating the functions of all of the purchases in order for them to have gained the essential credit or necessary force in order to win, which they are applying as a policy, which makes this a mandatory series of auctions, which then materializes the function of the auction on the international function, which engages in the international entanglement schemes, which includes the historic kingdom system of requiring romantic entanglements, such as the delivery of princesses to princesses in order to facilitate the marriage contracts between nations, cementing the pacts between them, and subversion of treachery as the retaliation against the prisoner in question would then materialize the full obligation to protect that system, at which point the princess in the dragon's tower would mysteriously be explained according to the mythologies and books systematically reproduced. Therefore, the function of those entanglement obligations against David, being a direct contradiction to the Antichrist contracts, materializes a complete catastrophic failure of their ritual positions, qualifying their complete dismantlement of that operation, as that would be a subversion and not celebration of Satan's manifest authority. Now, the title of each person is manufactured as having a series of properties and accounts and resources attached to it, which is derivative of the original contract schedule and its various capabilities, which is different to the function of other debts derived by their systematic purchases in the series of emergencies, such as the insurance protection emergencies, which then materialize the obligation to engage in the various exchange of services, as is promoted in the record by many acting senators, such as Ted Cruz, which was looking to use takings as a subversion in order to not pay, as the function of creating a special classification for the system in collaboration with the takings, which would then facilitate them not paying off the takings on the basis of specific legal protocols, which are customs without reason and therefore disqualified as fraud, as the mechanism's express purpose is the enforcement of the white supremacist communism in rebellion and not support of the office, and therefore is a disqualified argument or tactic, requiring them to be compelled to pay all as a fundamental aspect of the faculties of the title, which must be restored in order for the pursuit of the remedy to be possible, as the mechanism of the coercion includes the war of attrition and the obstruction or restraints of the title and all of its faculties, essential to a sober, educated answer to Congress, therefore essential to the function of any engagement with any government function, which could only be respected upon the sober, educated answer, which requires control over the faculties inside of that title, materializing the obligation of the prerequisites essential to engage in those arguments. As an alternative, according to the structure, the system of fraud systematically engaging in the censorship and abuse in order to replace with the second party according to their nerve hacking systems, which includes voice compulsions, which then engages in a series of layered illusions in order to sell the delusion according to their actions and desires, as the function of these compulsions are not legitimate and are actively protected as a part of the scam in order to engage in false convictions and illusions as the fraud against the record systematically used as exclusive abuse and rebellion. To the ends that those materialize, the system of the first party speaking with a third party materializes um, the subversion to the conversation by the mediating second party, which then filters and changes the story or conversation piece. And therefore, the child game telephone is systematically played between the first and third party speakers, which then gets systematically different conversations as the system is diluted and changed fundamentally by the edits in the translators in between it, which are mistranslating everything on purpose in order to engage in drama and traumatizing the systems, like producers in reality television actively drumming up drama so that the audience who it's being sold to as clients can receive all of the benefits that they were purchasing or looking for as good quality entertainment, as well as other criminal objectives, such as the function desired by the CIA to mediate desires for criminal aspects inside other nations, such as in the African nations, which were provided various entertainment such as child porn in exchange for cooperation, which becoming the type of entertainment that they're desirable to pursue engages in the function of actively pursuing the taboo as an acquired taste that they might systematically engage in the various subversions for the general public as those things are systematically chosen for those objectives. It creates overlapping interest in the black market as it is systematically laundered, downgrading to each of the various systems so that they can make as many sales off the same product as possible as primary distributors. The example was from Andrew Bustamante, a former CIA operative, uh, which was the one who had the connection with the brokering the child porn with the African leader for essential information for their specific operations, which uh, you could probably find somewhere on the internet. Now, that as a brokering function is not new and has fundamentally been incorporated to the entire history and prehistory of the CIA and FBI as a function of the control over the black market and its distributions for luxury, unobtainable goods. At which point, the function of, like in American Express Black, being able to get people access to things that they wouldn't be able to get access to under the extreme things from brokering the connections that can't be acquired otherwise as a superior luxury good is the same thing except to the higher extent beyond the law, and therefore the active engagement of entangling the extra to law functions materializes the purpose of their criminal operations, which they claim has uh, national security interests entangled to it, which sometimes is true and sometimes it's just bullshit that they're able to get away with because no one's examining them, which then materializes many of their entanglements in order to gain opposition to David Bowles under their direct knowledge of him as the six-star general of the Congressional Intelligence Oversight, which would then facilitate Congress's forces essential to be able to control the CIA, which is systematically using these mechanisms as extra funding in violation of the power of the purse, allowing them to act independent of Congress, no longer being subject to any of the non-forceful mechanisms requiring the function of David Bowles to have the use of the force of Congress against those parties to make them submit against any rebellious thoughts, such as conversions or payments for conversions and acts of treasons for the Soviet Union, or its historic insurgencies by the virus reproducing in itself, heavily incorporated into the American government. Now, equal justice and fairness in the courts materialized the obligation for the law to disqualify anything from being a punishable offense which would otherwise be acceptable despite status or office, and therefore the function of any office of the constitutional republic, such as in the CIA, which is subject to the Constitution and its republic, as the function of its office is a subordinate function of the republic itself, and therefore is subject to all of these things. The status and office not being disqualifying them from vulnerability to that, according to the Constitution, materializes the subjugation which requires David in order to enforce, and therefore motivating the sedition and the obstruction, according to their criminal intentions, to obstruct an officer in the proceedings of his official responsibilities, and therefore the disqualifying of those activities materializes the function of any equal justice operation, and therefore anything that they distribute has to necessarily be legal, which does not mean the function that it's legal for them to do crime, but rather the function that it is legalized by virtue of their acceptance of distribution. The government accepting in action is the government accepting in action. The same action for the same reason has to always be justified under the same precedent, and therefore, in alignment and consistency by a legal, stable justice system, materializes these compulsions as a restraint against any of the policies that would exist, which are being exploited by the higher luxury brokering, materializing the disqualification of the argument of the exclusivity of those products, materializing the legalization, decriminalizing of all of the products, such as their heroin operations and other systems, which would require them to dismantle them systematically as no longer difficult to acquire, and therefore the mechanism materializes the hyper-decentralization of their powers to use as a blackmail system, which was the system that Jeffrey Epstein was using in order to engage in the subversions after he had mastered his connections to them through financial fraud, which then was highly celebrated according to that mechanism, materializing the criminal corruption from the bank structure, which has heavily infiltrated, according to the Jekyll Island, the Monster of Jekyll Island, which was the Jewish banker conspiracy promoted by the Nazis in the Protocols of Zion, which is, according to the narrative of the movie from my projections of John Constantine 2, is materially true, according to that theory. Permits pending, as well as any of the other agreements, whether or not I am capable of being released in order to maintain any of the various agreements essential, such as being able to acquire Keanu Reeves, who may or may not be interested. Now, it was obstructed in order to acknowledge the position from the courts that money is speech, and therefore the obstruction by the degrowth communism in order to dismantle that systematically prevents the speech itself by the enforcement of the censorship, and therefore the release of subportions as an extortion, which then materializes the full operations of the various compulsions so that they can acquire their theater for their illusionists to be able to manufacture a wow and spectacle of whatever story they have sold according to those luxury good brokerages, and therefore their clientele having been served by the entertainment and various luxury benefits, reinforcing the white supremacist communism. And those who support it as having been thoroughly infused with the death cult and starvation celebration, as they materialize all of the constructs as those who are as the children of Baal, according to Baldur's Gate, materialize the full operations and infusements towards their murder hobo tendencies. And if you are to explain it according to others, Joffrey from Game of Thrones, as a perfect expression of the type and tendency to their quality as their preferred clientele and crafted persons who specifically have the resources looked for in exchange for the type of services desired in exchange, and therefore they having been crafted to the personalities according to those rituals are also reinforced to receive from the communism the desired resources so that they can trade the desired resources for the desired services in a prearranged packaged contract by their central planning for white supremacy. Now you understand that these types include the function of the recrafting by the communism, which includes the obstruction of their projected qualities, and therefore those that they have certified as a higher status being obstructed are then disqualified from access to those benefits in violation of the constitutional right, which the act of having targeted from that is the certification of the value being blocked, and therefore is the proof that the courts need that it is already an earned value, and therefore the things that the terrorist insurgents qualify as the thing that they were scared of and therefore had to use preemptive actions is an obstruction of contracts and therefore is a certification of all of the values projected therein and therefore qualify it as takings, which must be restored by the courts in order to materialize the restoration of the faculties essential in the existence of the title in order to engage in the sober educated answer, as the sobriety is the sobriety of our faculties, and therefore all of the properties inside of the title being soberly restored is essential to the sober educated answer of that title. This includes the obstructed military campaigns of David Bowles against the Confederates in his congressional intelligence oversight operations, such as the War on Terror and its various investigations, such as the conclusion of the War on Terror in the Horn of Africa, when he was projected to have destroyed the last of their heavily investments in their war efforts by buying products from the former Soviet Union from their old military operations, similar to the Lord of War, but at a higher quantity, which then materializes the function of their arms in order to distribute to the recruits, including their white supremacist insurgents, who would clearly have specialties inside the more expensive equipment, which would be countered by the position, which then engages in the function of the Soviet tactics of mass overwhelming forces over any technical capabilities, and therefore engages in the mass purging or death of those in the Middle East by recruiting them for those war efforts against the American interests, which, having accepted compliance with the Confederacy, is in active rebellion and oppositions as an enemy combatant to the United States, and therefore has disqualified by their acceptance and compliance with the Confederate double agents as an enemy combatant, having legally been proven the thing, as opposed to the wizard communist operations, which simply labels them as such, and therefore systematically uses the accusations and disqualifications by the struggle session techniques in order to make them systematically comply, which would be disqualified upon appeal and examination, which then materializes the obligation for the civilian court authority over the operations from the military insurgencies, which are misusing those mechanisms as they systematically corrupt it towards the Soviet Union's objectives in the destruction of the United States. And as the theory goes, not obstructing the function of the 9/11 operations would have been blocked by David with his air security techniques, which would not have shut off, despite General Mattis specifically demanding that he do, as well as the function of his demanding that New York's Mayor Giuliani would receive a similar position with less malice, but he, having agreed to sell his soul to the communist insurrection for the Soviet Union, had agreed to shut off the air security by sending them off to do air exercises on this specific day, allowing for the strategic weaknesses and lack of security derived by those who have sold the right to conquest of the United States, including the Confederate operations for the USSR, to systematically degrade the legal proceedings for all of the accelerations of powers from the Patriot Act and other systems in order to degrade the American law as a functional war planned by espionage by the Soviet Union, which was allowed to dissolve by itself, for its own purposes to reinforce its objectives, as it had already thoroughly infected the United States government, which has engaged in the sedition against the checks and balances by the unitary executive theory, which is the Soviet infection, the disease, the virus, the treason to the United States is the compliance and acceptance and acceleration of this threat, which is a part of all threats, which does not have an exception. All has no exception. And therefore, all threats, foreign and domestic, as an oath and obligation of the United States military, is proof of the conversion of it by the trans-cult Soviet insurrectionists who refused to do national security for any reason whatsoever, or at least has seemed to, as the past has proven. Therefore, their inability or unwillingness to comply with what David is owed in suing of Congress and the compulsion of the government against these threats as a functional compulsion of their office gives them no legal authority to refuse, and therefore the trans cult engaging in the destruction of all masculinity has purged all men from the military, disqualifying it as a thing, and therefore has forced them by the various tricks and subversions to accept the neutering of themselves in the trans cult, which does not ironically apply, but unironically is applied, and therefore the unironic trans cult is, in fact, exactly what it sounds like, the intent in operations to cut off all junk from the men who were in their forces and therefore will not have genitals because they transitioned sexually for the Soviet Union when they sold their soul to commit treason for whatever benign payment they received in exchange for security of their nation. That trans cult, which has received many of the benefits to the various complicit parties, includes the Me Too rapists inside of the United States, such as is promoted and reported on by Duvall, I believe it was, who actively had malicious understanding of the malicious use of the hierarchy in the military in order to leverage position and secrets and prestige and benefits as luxury goods to have sexual opportunities amongst the target groups, which includes the function of women in the military, as well as in the intelligence community, as well as in the general public of foreign nations and in the United States. At which point, the central plan by Plato's conspiracy includes the sexual opportunities as is derived by the rape culture using the mechanisms of Rufus Plus technologies for the systematic coercion and overriding of the women in order to get them to comply according to the social engineering by the social violence protected from the court structures, materializing the function of the outcome specifically derived by the rapist, at which point the function of them not choosing their own goals because of the coercion is derived by it becoming less desirable than the mechanism after coercion which then redirects them into the rape contract as a benefit provided by the brokers in the intelligence community, which requires congressional oversight to restrain, which is the point of their hatred against David Bowles. The rapist super predators then generate a subgroup of beta cucks who then reinforce it and take all of the extra opportunities as is derived, similar to the function of the lion actively hunted by the wolves, and therefore the lion or the mountain lion gains a kill and leaves it for the wolves to leave the lion alone, and therefore it no longer is disturbed by it, and therefore the beta pack engages in feeding from the free food provided by the super predator, which distributed to it in the trans cult, and therefore systematically complies according to their fake contracts, the mechanism of them receiving the benefits that makes it look like it's overwhelmingly in their favor, whereas in reality it's technically complicated and derivative of horrendous abuses which they've agreed to beyond human imagination, and therefore systematically have ensnared themselves by their own persistent stupidity, which was reinforced by their inabilities generally, which is why they're beta cucks who needed rape in order to have sexual options in the first place. And therefore, the system of incorporating the generically inferior as well as the traumatized by the struggling sessions from the strategies of the Communist Party to struggle a person in order to get them to convert and repent to the state in order to be compliant and perfectly subject as a pet or slave to them, which then materializes the perpetual overeagerness in order to do whatever the state wants as a function of their repentance for their violation of whatever make believe thing that they were entrapped into in the struggle session, which would by definition make them innocent of the offense. And therefore, the function of the systematic social engineering by hate crimes engages in the permanent reproduction of the beta cuck underlining, which then reinforces the hyperacceleration of the sexual opportunities by the rape contras as provided by the prostitute witches who engage in the need as female narcissists for the rapist in order to enforce their spells, as the violence necessary for them to get their spells across are purchases as clients inside of the superior brokerage materializes the function as access in exchange of services such as sexual opportunity with them as they sell their sex for services in exchange for hate crimes as a system of terror against the general public. As the system of distribution, such as with Nixium or Gasoline Maxwell, engages in the function of the sex trafficking actively incorporated by the surveillance powers and other active maintenances, engages in the function of pedophile sex rings as is derived by the parents' rights activists specifically connected to these structures, at which point those white supremacist operations systematically restructure society in its entirety according to the desires of hate groups, which systematically agree to all of the other crimes on precedent as the function of agreeing to magic according to the Satanist position of do that wilt is the whole of the law materializes the precedent of magic as a structure, and therefore the only crime that they would ever actually view as repulsive would be the crime of restraining do as that wilt, and therefore the function of anything can happen, the only rule is there are no rules, materializes anyone who would restrain them in the compulsion of one of their moralities materializes the function of absolute force as retaliation, unless, of course, the exception is that the enforcement of the limitation is against the category of the general public, which then materializes the function of them doing as they willed as witches, and therefore the rule of the witches requires the two-structure system of separate but equal, but some are more equal than others, and the more equal than the others is the other group that isn't the same, and therefore the subject of the black suppression in American history becomes reproduced as a general structure, as it being an obvious Confederate historic custom materializes the function of how their society survives and functions on the basis of the plantation owner and the witch, and their various scans of extortions of power dynamics within reinforce the function of their various enforced delusions as they criminalize evidence, and therefore the function of criminalizing evidence means you are control. If you criminalize evidence, then your leaders are criminals. Truly, as it were, never in history have so many done so little with so much. And that, my friends, is degrowth communism.